Okay, you guys are here. Let's begin. So today our topic of discussion is debugger, a tool for debugging. And in this video, we are gonna cover debugger for JavaScript, TypeScript, Node.js, and React.js as well. So there's a lot to learn ahead. Let's begin. Hey man, you told me it's a tool for debugging. But what the heck is debugging? So for all of those who don't know, let me tell you that debugging is the process to find bugs in your code. Yeah, finding bugs in your code. And also by bugs I mean logical errors. Okay? But how exactly we debug our code? What is the process? What is the strategy? Well, I want you to answer a simple question. When do you say that there is a logical error in your code? When do you say it? I'm guessing probably when your code doesn't execute according to your logic, according to your algorithm, as you have expected it to be. So I would say we have logical errors in our code when the flow of execution of our code gone wrong. So in order to find logical errors in your code, we need to examine the flow of execution of code. And there we got a new definition of debugging. Debugging is nothing but a process to examine the flow of execution of our code. And if we can examine the flow of execution of our code, we can easily find the logical errors. So let's take an example of simple web page that has some logical errors and try to debug it. Let's go. Okay, so we have a web page here. What does it do? It simply takes the first name and the last name of someone and greet him. So if I give Michael and Jackson, it should greet, hey Michael Jackson. Now let's try. Oops, it's not doing it the right way. The first name and the last name got switched up. So it's a logical error in our code. So let's debug it. In order to debug it, we have to find the line where we are sending the alert, and that's where there it is, line number 9. Okay, but it looks good. I think look at that. The f name variable and the l name variable are in the right sequence as they should be. That means the problem is in their value. The f name and the l name variables are getting the wrong values, and they're getting their values from these two variables. Now let's try to console log these two variables to find out what's going wrong. Okay, so let's just console.log f name element, l name element, and our beloved semicolon. Let's run it again. Oh, before that, I would like to tell you that I'm using an extension that is live server. This extension is very handy at we don't need to refresh our code every time we edit it. It just do it automatically for us. But I'm not using this extension just for this functionality. When you debug your HTML files with JavaScript files, you need this extension to run your code in debugger. So make sure you have it, okay? Without further delay, let's give it a test again. Oh, before that, open the console. Mm, Let me expand it for you. Looks good. And here's our console. Okay. And we have these two DOM elements in our console. The first element is a DOM element with the ID f name, but it has the placeholder last name. And as you can see in the left, it's pointing towards the last name. So there was a logical error in our HTML file, and we were able to debug it. So let's correct it and rerun our code. Okay. And there we have the error, f name and l name. And it automatically refreshed as I told you. Let's try it out. Wow. So you just did your first debugging. Congratulations. Hold on. What we just covered is debugging via console.log. And it's a layman's way for debugging. We're gonna cover other efficient methods as well. And the next method in our list is, wait for it, debugger keyword of JavaScript. So let's see what is it. Let's talk about this interesting keyword. For that I need to replace my console log with this keyword debugger and see what happens. Let me fill the values. Before that, let me just open the console and expand it for you. Okay, now there we go. This interface you're looking at is called the Chrome debugger, which is the default debugger for Chrome browser. And here you can see that the code stops executing. It has paused its execution as it reaches the keyword debugger. That means we are getting the control over the flow of execution of the code. But we are not getting the values of the variables like the f name and the l name that we are getting before using console log. Actually, let me tell you, we are getting these values as well. This is the beauty of debugger. And for that reason, I want to grab your attention towards this scope panel. In this panel, you can see the current values of all the variables in your code until this point. So it simply means that we don't need to console log anymore. Look at the value of f name and l name variables here. Yes, they are correct. We have already corrected our mistake, our silly mistake in the HTML file. Also note that they are in local scope because they are a part of our current function. And by current function, I mean the function at which our execution is paused. On the other hand, fname element and lname element, these two DOM elements are in the script scope because they are defined inside our script index.js, but they are outside the scope of current function. That's why they reside in script scope but not in the local scope. Then we have the global scope and it contains all the global variables of our code. Now focus on to the next panel, that is call stack, this one. It basically show you the current status of function call stack. You guys might know what is function call stack. Or if you don't know, in other words, I would say using this panel, you can keep an eye on which function is being called by which function. For example, when I click on this greet button, it triggers a function called onClick, which then calls a function handleClick. Here I've defined it, which then calls our function greet, which is at the top. Now let me tell you one thing, that the current function, that means the one that has been paused, will be always at the top of the call stack. That's why our greet function is at the top of the call stack with this arrow mentioning that you have been paused on this function. Now the third important panel of our discussion is watch panel. This is my favorite panel. You're gonna use this panel every time you debug your code. Using this panel, you can specify variable names to watch their values. To watch a variable, you need to add that variable. Let's add fname element. Fname element. See, we got its value. But wait, let me show you one another trick. You guys know that fname element is an input DOM element. And these input DOM elements have a property called value. Let's try to access that property in the watch panel and see whether we can get the value or not. Boom! We are getting the values. So that means that in the watch panel, we are not only getting the variables values, but also their property values as well. Now, to resume the execution of the script, you need to press this play button. The script start executing normally as it should be. It will again pause at the instance where it will encounter this keyword debugger. But for this particular function or this particular script, we just have one debugger instance and it will not encounter any other and just execute normally. Let's try it out. Yeah, you can see that. But if I again give some input and try to again trigger the greet function, it will again pause at that instance, as you can see that. We just talk about our second method of debugging, and that is the keyword debugger. Along with that, we just got introduced with Chrome browser's inbuilt debugger interface. But, we still have a problem. Let's say you want to pause your code at multiple instances. In that case, you have to write and delete this keyword again and again at multiple lines in your code. And eventually, it will result in this. Okay, so I introduced the problem. Now let me give you the solution. And the solution is breakpoint. Now, what is this breakpoint? Well, it is a third method of debugging. In Chrome Debugger, you can set multiple breakpoints instead of writing debugger keyword. Let me show you how to do that. So, we are back with our old copy of code where we are using this keyword debugger. Now, as I told you that you can use breakpoints instead of this keyword. So let's just remove it from our code. And our application got refreshed automatically. And to set breakpoints, what do you have to do? First of all, let's expand it. Oops, expand this and open the console. You have to go to the sources panel and you have this debugger interface as I show you before. Now go to the file where you want to set the breakpoint and we have a debugger keyword before this line, this alert function. So let's set a breakpoint at this line. Okay. To set a breakpoint, you have to click on this left panel where you have the line numbers. So let's click here. As you can see, it shows that I have a breakpoint here. What will what it will do eventually is it will just stop the execution of the code just before executing this line. So this line will not get executed. We will not see the alert when we reach this point, this breakpoint. So let me do it for you. And great, as you can see. And if I just click on the play button, it will resume the script execution and you can see the alert. If you don't believe me, let me set the breakpoint to the next line and it will prove that this line will get executed and this will not. Again, there we go, and it stops the execution here. And you have all the panels, whether scope panel, whether watch panel, everything you have here. Also, now I want to introduce to a new panel. Here's the panel, breakpoints panel. It will list all your breakpoints in your code. For example, if I set another breakpoint, it will list that. You can just remove your breakpoint from here as well. So that's all about the breakpoints. We just talk about breakpoints and how we can use them in Chrome Debugger. Now, what if I tell you that you can use debugger within VS Code? And I know that's why most of you are watching this video. So from now onwards, we'll be debugging our code within VS Code and not in Chrome browser. I know you guys are excited. Let's dive into the VS Code. So We are in VS Code, and here you can see that our app is running on localhost 5500, port number 5500. Now, to debug your application within VS Code inbuilt debugger, you have to set up the debugger before. For that, you have to click on this function. It is the debugger option, and here you have got the option to create a launch.json file. This file is the configuration file for your debugger project. Okay, now it will ask you to select the environment. Now ask yourself a simple question. At this point, you have to ask yourself the question. The script that you are debugging is going to run in which environment? Let's say I want to debug this JavaScript file. Where it will run? It will definitely run in a browser. And if it is running in a browser, you have to select the Chrome environment. Now, it has created a skeleton file for us and we can edit it. We won't edit a lot of things into this file, just one thing. And that one thing is the URL. What is this URL? This URL is basically the endpoint where your app is running. In this case, default URL is set to 8080, but in our case, our app is running on 5500. So let's change it. Okay, that's all we need to do. Actually, this is the URL from where debugger start watching your script. Okay, it will start keeping an eye on your script from this URL. Okay, now we have set up our launch.json file, or you can say the configuration file for the debugger. Now, what is the next step? Well, the next step is to set the breakpoints, right? So let's close this file and set a breakpoint on line number 8. How do we set a breakpoint? It's pretty similar to the Chrome debugger. For that, you have to go to the left. As you can see, there's a red mark. Just click here. And as you can see, it's the breakpoint. Now we need to launch the debugger. We have configured our debugger. We have set up the breakpoint, and the third step is to launch the debugger. And for that we have this play button. Okay, let's just launch, or you can just press the F5 key on your keyboard. So it launched the debugger, and let me tell you, it has launched another instance of the Chrome browser. The previous one is still running, and this one is running on localhost 5500, and that one actually they are the same thing. That is not our point of discussion, right? Now let's try to give it some values and see whether it works perfectly or not. And as soon as I agree, it stops the execution here. And as soon as I press the play button, it greets. So everything is simple. Everything is similar to the Chrome debugger. We just got a new interface. What else we have here? We have a debug console. We have call stack. I've told you what is it. We have the watch panel, my favorite one. We have the variables panel as well. Let's do it again to see what does this panel contain. See, it has local, script, and global scope. The variables panel is basically the scope panel of Chrome debugger. Actually, this name is better than the scope one, whatever it is. Now just press the play button and yeah, there we go. So you just learn about Chrome browser's inbuilt debugger. Now, before starting with a new topic, I want you to know that if you go to the project folder, you can see there's a .vs code folder here and it contains the configuration file. So in future, if you want to edit your file, you can just find it here. That's all. Now, continuing our discussion on VS Code's debugger, let me tell you something more about it. A much more interesting approach of using the debugger. let me just close it, and we have a breakpoint here. Give it some values and great. It stops the execution at the breakpoint. We all know that. Now the next step is to press the play button. It will execute the script. Since we do not have other breakpoint, it will just execute the script completely. Sure, we know that. But what if I tell you I want to execute the script line by line? I want to see the status of the function, status of the variables on each line. For that, you might say, Naman, just let multiple breakpoints and press the play button. No, 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 no. We don't have to do that. We have got this step into function, or I would say step over function button. It's not a function. I'm sorry. Let's press this. So it executed the line number 8. This one we got the alert, and it shifts the cursor, the debugger cursor, to the next line. Now if I press again, it does the same, and then okay, and here this function was called here, and it brings the execution to the next line. So we have got a bunch of other options as well. We're going to talk about these options further in the video. So are you guys excited? Let's dive into it. So here's the debugger toolbar. Each button you see here is a step, and they're known as continue step, step over, step into, and step out. And then we are left with two other buttons, which are restart and stop. Now we're going to discuss each of these steps in detail. But before that, what does this restart and this stop button do? Well, as the name suggests, the restart button restart the debugger, and the stop button stop it. Now, moving forward with our discussion, let's discuss about continue step. We've used it quite a lot of time till now, and you guys are very well aware of what does it do. Well, it executes the function or script until it reaches next breakpoint. Or I would say it will move the debugger cursor to the next breakpoint. Let me show you how. We're back with in our code. Let's set two breakpoints, and let's start the debugger. We don't need to create the configuration file again and again. We have already created it once per project, and it will work. Okay, so we have two breakpoints. Let's start the debugger. It's working. Give it some input, and great. Stops the execution. If I press the continue button, it will jump to the next breakpoint, which is on the line number 8. You can see that. Oops, let me show you this one. Let me just minimize it. Cool. Now as soon as I click it again, it will execute the line number 8 as well, and the consecutive lines after that. Boom. Now let's just discuss about our next step, which is step over. To understand step over button, let's just remove these two breakpoint and set a breakpoint at line number 6 and give it some input. Well, you don't necessarily have to give it, still give it some input. So it stops the execution here. Now what if I press the step over button, or I click on it? It executes one line and jumps over to the next, then this, and then this. Okay, moves to the next. So it executes one statement at a time. But here's the catch. If I remove this breakpoint and set a breakpoint here where a function is being called, so as the name suggests, step over, it will step over to the function. That means it will execute the complete function at once. So let's restart the debugger first of all, and give it some input, and great. So it stops the execution here, and if I click on the step over button, it will execute the greet function completely at once. Look at that. It executed the entire function completely. So it executes one statement at a time, But if the statement is a function being called, it will execute the entire function in one go. But, wait a second. Let's now set another breakpoint in the greet function and restart the debugger. Give it some input and greet. Again, we pause the execution here, and if I press the step over function, it stops on the next breakpoint. So what does it mean? That it will definitely execute the function, the greet function, completely at once until and unless it doesn't encounter any breakpoint there. It will definitely stops the execution on the breakpoint. Okay. So now we know what does step over function do, or what does step over button do. Now to understand step into, we have to restart the debugger. Let's remove these two breakpoints and set a breakpoint again on line number 6. Let's do that. Oops, what's the problem? Wait a sec. Oh, here's the problem. Yeah, now we are in same state. Now set a breakpoint at line number 6 and give it some input again. Great. Stops the execution. Now the step into. Okay. Now it's working just like step over. It's working the same way. It executing one statement at a time. But as the name suggests, step into, it will go into the function. Okay, let me show you. Set a breakpoint on line number 14 and restart the debugger and understand the difference. What does it make? Great. And step into, not over, into. You just got to know the difference. The difference is it will also execute one statement at a time. But if the statement is a function being called, it will go to the first line of the function. But in case of step over, it will just step over to the function and just execute the function at once. Moving on to the third step, that is step out. And as the name suggests itself, it will step out of the current function. For example, now let me just set just one breakpoint here and it will make clear. Restart the debugger. Okay. Just give it some input again and greet. Now we are into a function. Now let's say the function is quite long. It will calling other function as well, and you want to execute the current running function, not the one you are calling into the function, but the function being running right now. What is our current function? The current function right now is greet, and you want to execute it in one go. For that, you have to use the step out step. Oh, it's so confusing. Let me show it to you. Okay, it's executed the function and move it to the next line where the function being called. So we have understood what each step of the debugger toolbar do, and if you use it effectively, it can save you a lot of time. Cool. Now just let us just revise what we have studied so far. We've already discussed the continuous step, which means it will just jump to the next breakpoint. The step over will execute one statement at a time, but it will execute the entire function at once if the statement is a function call. And if encounter a breakpoint during execution, then it will definitely pause at the breakpoint. Step into, do the same thing, but the only difference is if the current statement is a function call, then instead of executing it at once, it will jump into the first line of the function definition. Step out, execute the current function in one go. Move the debugger cursor to the next line from where the current function was called. And it also, if encounter a breakpoint while executing, then pause at the breakpoint for sure. So till now we have understood everything we need to know about the debugger and the debugging in JavaScript. Now we'll move forward our discussion with debugging in TypeScript, React.js, and Node.js. Okay, let's do this. Let us discuss about debugging in TypeScript. I have a very minimalistic TypeScript file here. So the step one would be to compile the TypeScript file into the JavaScript file, because you know that in browser TypeScript doesn't work. We have to use the JavaScript file within the browser context. Okay, how do we do that? We have something called TypeScript compiler. You guys might know if you're working with TypeScript. I, I I have it installed on my system. You guys install it in yours, and let's do this. First of all, let's create a configuration file for compilation. We created it, and now just tsc is the command, the TypeScript compiler, to generate the JavaScript file. Yeah, we have it. Cool. Now we need to do one more thing. Go to the tsconfig file and search for this property source map and uncomment it and set it to true. Why? Why do we need to do this? Well, as I told you that in your browser, the file that will be running is your index.js, but the file that you will be coding is index.ts, or the TypeScript file. So you want to set the breakpoints type in TypeScript file, not in index.js. So this property, when you set it to true, will ensure that the index.js will be running in browser, and it will stop executing and will show you the debugger cursor in your TypeScript file. And since I have modified the tsconfig file, I need to recompile it to JavaScript. Cool. And it has created a new file that you don't need to worry about. Okay. So what's the next step? The next step is to create a launch.json file, or the configuration file for debugging. Let's go here and create a launch.json file. It asking you for the environment. Since it's a simple web page, it will be running in a browser. So let's select Chrome. Now, the next thing we need to change is the URL. It should be 5500. Why it is 5500? Because we'll be using live server and it will run our app on this port. I can show you here. Go live, and you can see it's running on port 5500. Let's close this instance. Now, we have a breakpoint on line number 3 in TypeScript file. We have set up our configuration file. We have also set this property to true, and we have recompiled our JavaScript. We are good to go to use the debugger. Let's just launch it, and also we are running on port 5500. Let's launch it. Okay, and yep, as you can see, we have successfully paused our script on the breakpoint. Now, from here, you can do whatever you want to do. You have learned so far. Next step is to learn debugging in Node.js. Let's go. Okay, so let's begin. In order to explain you how to debug in Node.js, I have a very simple Express app here, and let's try to run it. Node server.js. So it's working fine. And if I just go to localhost 3000, it says hello world, and it logging everything. It's everything working fine. Now I want to debug this application. So let me just set up two breakpoints. This one here and one here. Let me just close this instance. I don't want to run it in terminal right now. I'll tell you why. In order to debug, you all know that we need the configuration file. So let's create one. Now carefully select the environment. Now our application will be running in Node.js environment and not in the browser context. So you don't have to select the Chrome. Instead, select the Node.js now. Now, here you don't have to set up the URL like you were doing before. Here you have to set up your initial file from where your script, your project will start executing. In my case, if we look at the directory, I have a file server.js. So in my case, it's all right. Let's say you have a file app.js, so you have to modify it accordingly. We're good to go. Now, you don't have to explicitly write down like node server.js when you're debugging. No, go to the debugger. We have set up our debugger with the configuration file. Now just launch it. Stops executing at the breakpoint. Now let's hit the play button. Cool. Now just refresh it. As soon as you refresh it, oops, let me just, it's showing the previous output. I need to, yeah, it's loading and it hasn't shown any output yet. But if you go to the debug console, you can see that the it has two logs here. The one is server is running on port 3000. It came from the line number 30, and the other is get request on localhost 3000. That is JavaScript's line number 6. It has executed this line and it has stopped executing, or it has paused the execution on line number 7. As soon as I hit the play button, it will continue the execution and you will see the output here. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, as you can see that. That's all. That's all you need to know about the debugging in Node.js. Now you can solve your problems accordingly. Now, our next target is debugging in React. Let's begin. Now we're gonna discuss about debugging in React.js. And for that, I have a very minimalistic app that says hello world and run on localhost 3000. And when you click on this button, it generates an alert. So right now my app is running on localhost 3000. Now, in order to debug it, let me just set a breakpoint here. You guys know our next step would be to create the configuration file for debugging. Let's do this. Create a configuration file. Now, just hold on for a second. Ask me this question: which environment I need to choose, whether it's a Node.js environment or the Chrome. Well, most of the people think that since the React app is being running in terminal, the environment should be Node.js. Well, that's not correct. The React app is not running in terminal. It is actually running in the browser context. That's why it is a front-end application. That's how you can just make the analogy. So choose the Chrome. Now in here, you have to set the localhost 3000 URL because I told you that our app is running on that. That's all. That's all you need to do. Now what's the next step? Now launch the debugger and make sure before you launch the debugger, your app is running. If it's not running, then restart the app by npm start. But if it's not running, it won't work. So my app is actually running on port 3000 and it's working good. And I have a breakpoint here on my function, which get triggered on when I click on this button. So let's just, okay. So we have this. Now, if I just click on this button, awesome. Our script got paused here. And when I just, whoo, there we go. So we have just completed our discussion on debugger. We learned the basics of debugger, how to use it using different steps, how to use in different technologies like JavaScript, TypeScript, Node.js, React.js, and I'm gonna end my discussion here. Thank you for your time. Okay, so just let me just tell you something about myself. This video is a freelancing project, and you can, if you find any doubt in the video and you want to ask something more about it, you can always find me on LinkedIn. Here's my profile. And if you want me to work for you and serve you as a freelancing client, you can choose whether LinkedIn or if you prefer Upwork, here's my Upwork profile as well. You can choose whatever you want to. That's all from my side. Thanks for your time and happy coding.